Welcome to the January 27th, 2025 episode of the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop. Now, you probably have noticed that I have my camera turned off today, and there's a reason for that. Yesterday, while biking, I took a tumble and landed headfirst, wearing a helmet, thank goodness. But I cut my eye for 11 stitches, just above my eye, and my face is not fit for polite company and video. So today, for the next few weeks, while I heal up, we're going to have, you'll see in front of you, MC Bredner from our team. Welcome to the show, MC. She's going to be co-hosting with me today, and I'm going to remain. I won't have my camera turned on, but I will be here. So, MC, today we're going to talk about. We're kind of calling it tentatively. This is our last week, this morning episode. We're going to review what went on late last week and over the weekend. What's your take of what's going on in the energy world these days with Donald Trump and all of the chaos he's unleashed, both in the United States but also in Canada?
Well, there's no shortage of things to read about what's going on in energy. Um, I mean, for me, it was the big story over the weekend was the energy secretary being appointed. Yeah, there's just so much going on, and the chaos is a lot to digest. And I guess it's just trying to figure out, how is this going to impact Alberta? What does this mean for Canada? What does this mean for jobs? Where are we going to export energy? What do we need to import? There's just so many questions and so many executive orders to try to weed through.
Well, let's talk about Chris Wright, who's the new energy secretary, and he has a background as he runs a company, CEO of a big oil and gas services company. And he
Mhm.
also published a document, and I forgot to take the title of it. Maybe you have it handy, but he wrote basically a tome extolling the virtues of hydrocarbons and the there's a reason why he's important. And the it'll become more apparent as we begin talking about the what Danielle Smith is really up to. I think that's if there's a theme to this show, it's it's what's going on in Canada and why is Danielle Smith influencing the energy conversation so much? What is she asking for? What is she doing? Um, and Chris Wright is part of the tradition in which, or the narrative group in which she finds herself. So let's talk about Smith. Let's start talking about Smith. And what do you make of Smith's refusal to join Team Canada? Because of course Trump has threatened 25% tariffs against all
Mhm.
Canadian uh, products, and the prime minister and the first ministers, the premiers of the provinces, and the territorial leaders met to discuss a united approach to Trump. And Smith was the holdout.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of her stick a little bit. I mean, she's never been clearly on Team Canada. She likes to, kind of pick a fight with the feds, and that seems to be kind of what she usually does. I think as long as I'm surprised that she didn't line up, with Doug Ford. He's obviously got some clear issues that these tariffs, around electric vehicles and batteries and the car industry in Ontario. So I'm surprised that she's not finding, some people to kind of align with or create maybe a team B, Team Canada. But yeah, I think it's kind of what she's known for and what her followers and supporters really like is to see her stand up and fight for Alberta. But I mean, in this case, I don't think she's fighting the right fight.
That is another theme of this conversation, and that is we're in Canada, we're having the wrong energy conversation. And
Yeah.
we're going to talk about why it's wrong and what the right conversation would look like. Yeah, it's she's been people on social media were calling her a traitor. They were, how dare you? Every other province came to the table and said, okay, if we have to cut back exports to the U.S., to counter, if we're going to have a trade war with Trump, and we're going to cut back, everybody's going to cut back. Right? It doesn't matter if you're British Columbian lumber, Saskatchewan
Yeah.
in wheat, and Mo Scott, the premier there, is a conservative. Doug Ford
Yeah.
with the auto industry, he's another conservative premier, which is why you mentioned you're surprised she didn't make common cause with him. And so they all put aside their provincial concerns to focus on the Team Canada approach, except Smith. And when the announcement, she didn't join their meeting, she joined it virtually. She's done a number of other things. Her social media, her Twitter account in particular, is just a dumpster fire, because she's talking about, at one point, she said, we should give the new president a win so that he can feel all manly, I guess, and feel like he's actually accomplished something. And that was seen, and frankly, I have to say it myself, I agree with it. It's appeasement. I call,
Yeah.
I called her a quisling, after the Norwegian prime minister in during the World War II, who just openly sided with the Nazis. I mean, you don't pick the side that's again the rest of us. You kind of got to stand shoulder to shoulder with your fellow Canadians. And quisling, I think, in this context, actually it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
So, oh, and then one of my favorite things she did last week was have a press release with the Enbridge CEO. Now, Enbridge Pipelines, they have the main line down into the U.S., carries the majority of Canadian oil to American markets, and he joined her in her pledge to double Alberta oil production. Now, and this was taken up. There was just a chorus of her supporters on social media this weekend praising her for that and repeating her calls, to double. And the well-known thought leader and provocateur Brett Wilson, who often tangles with me on Facebook, was on one of my threads, praising her as a leader who uniting Canada and
Mhm.
doing the leading the charge against Trump. And this I brought this up because this is the problem. This is Wilson shares with Danielle Smith and with the Alberta oil and gas CEOs and many people in Alberta a common view, a different view of where the energy system, the global energy system is going. Diametrically opposed to the one that the Liberals, the government in Ottawa, and the Biden administration when it was in power in Washington. And I think more than anything, if we don't understand the narrative context, like the thinking that the vision that they have for the future, their understanding of the future, we don't understand this debate at all. We're literally having the wrong conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I also think it's, her doing that press release with the CEO of Enbridge is kind of like we're just seeing all these big business people and government together making these announcements. I mean, I hate to draw the parallels to Elon Musk or other big business, people that were at, Trump's inauguration but that's kind of what we're seeing is government and big business kind of driving this narrative around oil and gas forever.
Yeah, I interviewed Dr. Kristen Van de Biesenboth, who is a law professor in San Diego, and we were talking about his Trump's energy emergency executive order. And she
Yeah.
made the point that what Trump has a plan. He wants to cut taxes for rich people, right? All the billionaires like Musk and Jeff Bezos and others that were at the inauguration, he wants to
Yeah.
cut their taxes. I don't even know if they're paying
Yeah.
taxes, but he wants to cut their taxes further. He needs money for it. And she said, well, one way to get it is through expanding oil and gas activity. But I
Yeah.
think there's actually something more going on. And I've written about this for the last couple of years. And so I want to spend a little time on it. And here's the thing. Um, our view here at Energy Media is, I think we've talked about this all the time. Clean energy technologies, wind, solar, EVs, batteries, heat pumps, and others that got started on the bottom of the S curve in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Now, 2020 was kind of the inflection point for most of those technologies. They're now competitive. They're starting to push fossil fuels technologies out of the market. It's very disruptive in the global energy system. That our view lines up with the International Energy Agency, which has been calling for peak oil demand in 2030, if not before. Could be 2028, as early as 2028. And then with a short shoulder and then a decline, which would lead probably to lower prices and trouble for the Alberta oil industry. That's not how Danielle Smith sees the world. And I know this
Mhm.
because she was at the World Petroleum Congress when it was in Calgary in September of 2023. And I covered that all 3 days of it. And the whole place was abuzz with what we call here the oil and gas forever narrative, which is really
Mhm.
kind of the OPEC Saudi narrative. And it's rooted in the OPEC's annual reports, the World Oil Outlook reports. The one in 2023 was uh, World Oil Outlook 2045. And then
Mhm.
last year they published 2050, which is a kind of an update to it. But here's the thing,
Right.
okay? Let me sketch out the way OPEC sees the world evolving. So they think that instead of peak oil demand in 2030, oil demand is actually between now and 2050 going to expand from 103 million barrels a day to 120 million barrels a day. So if you're Danielle
Right.
Smith and you know that Canada is one of the few um, jurisdictions that has enough oil that it could expand production, then you want to share that 17 million barrels a day expansion.
Yeah.
That's why she says right now we're making 4 million barrels a day, but the oil sands can expand. And now think of what it would be like if we were doing 8 million barrels a day. That
Mhm.
would make Canada's already the fourth largest oil producer in the world at 5 million. But if Alberta was eighth, it alone would be four, and it would be pushing Saudi Arabia and Russia, which are at about nine. That's
Wow.
the kind of power that Danielle Smith is chasing. I mean, look what oil revenues and that kind of oil production does
Yes.
for the Saudis and for Russia. You get money, tons of money, and you get power
Yeah.
that comes along with that and influence. So that's what she wants to do. And she also has all sorts of plans for gas, like LNG exports off the West Coast and so on. But the real moneymaker here for her is oil. So that's what we're going to focus on. And in order to understand how OPEC thinks about it, you need to think in terms to divide the world into global north and global south. So global north is essentially the rich economies. And for sure, that's North America, like that's US and Canada. That's all the European countries. That's China. Now, China kind of disputes being included, but we're going to include them because they're a driving force in the global economy. It includes Australia, South Korea, Japan, probably a few others that I've forgotten. Um, and OPEC modeling says that oil demand in the global north will decline between now and 2050. They admit that electrification of transportation, particularly ground
Mhm.
transportation, is going to lead to a decline in oil demand. But the global south is where the dispute is because their view of the global south. So now we're talking about Latin America, Africa, most of Asia, um, some of the Middle East, on and on. Um, their argument is that the global south is ready to rise. There are many, many emerging economies. They're on the cusp of being sort of middle economies, where with middle class, growing middle classes, growing consumption, and that will only accelerate over the next 25 years. So the way they see it, the global south, the increase in oil demand for road transport will be very significant because the global auto fleet will increase from 1.6 billion to 2.9 billion. That's a very large increase in 25
Yeah.
years. And they'll all be combustion engine cars. So by the time 2050 rolls around, the global fleet will still be 75% combustion cars. And most of them will be in the global south. Then on top of that, the global south's demand for, more consumer goods, for a higher lifestyle will lead to to an increase in petrochemicals, plastics
Right.
and products. And it'll also
Hmm.
lead to a big increase in aviation fuel because people are traveling more and they want to get out and see the world and, travel for business, that kind of thing.
Right.
So that that is the OPEC view of the world. And and here's something that we focus on a lot at Energy Media. The thought leaders like Wilson, and there's many of them, and I'm picking on him because he shows up in my, social media threads all the time. But he's only one of many in Alberta. Uh, they believe they believe that Canada can increase its production, but they also believe that climate change, while real, is not a big issue. Energy
Hmm.
poverty, so people who haven't got enough energy to meet their basic needs, is a bigger issue, and energy security, having enough energy to do the things, to run your economy and not having it interrupted, like the way we had interruptions and high prices, like when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022.
Right.
That is also a bigger problem than climate change. So, and this is exactly what Chris Wright believes.
100%.
Exactly. And now you've read
Hmm.
some of his stuff and you're agreeing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He acknowledges climate change, but then argues the benefits of increased energy consumption or increased, sorry, oil and gas consumption. Basically saying that the negatives of oil and gas consumption outweigh the impacts of climate change. So, I mean, I don't know if I would call that a philosophy, but he does make that pretty clear.
Yeah, and this narrative, there's lots of people who have laid out the foundation for that. So Bjorn Lomborg, the skeptical environmentalist, I think he calls himself, and Michael Schellenberger in the United
Hmm.
States, those are two right there. They're very prominent, and they've kind of put uh, the intellectual skin around this, the intellectual thinking. Wright himself has written a book, which is
Yeah,
very, sort of expanding on all of the ideas that we've talked about today.
yeah.
The big difference here is that there are those who believe that, and then there are those who believe that fervently, who are really aggressive about it. And
Yeah.
that would be,
Well, and I
and
think in Chris Wright's case, like he invests in solar or in renewables. I think what he's trying to say, he's actually trying to just show that he's legitimate. I think if you're 100% climate change denier, um, then people might question your legitimacy. But this is like his way of like legitimizing, let's use up the oil first before we go to that, next technology or next thing.
yeah, there's another key point in the World Oil Outlook modeling that I forgot to talk about, and that is their view of global primary energy demand. So if it's too bad we don't have our graphic with ready to put up, but you can find it anywhere. The World and Data site, you can go there and find global primary energy. And basically, what you're going to see is that starting in 1945, after World War II, it just skyrockets. and it goes up like a shot
Yeah.
over the next 80 years. And the point here is that new sources of electricity, like a big expansion of hydroelectric, a big expansion of nuclear, did nothing to change that trajectory. They were just simply added into coal,
Mhm.
oil, and natural gas. And the point that OPEC makes is that because of the emergence of the global south, global primary energy demand is going to continue to skyrocket, and anything we
Right.
produce in terms of wind and solar, advanced geothermal, whatever other sources of energy we can come up with, will also be only absorbed
Hmm.
into that growing primary demand and not displaced. See, that's the key. The
Right.
IEA says that greater electrification will lead to displacement of fossil fuels. And these guys argue, no, fossil fuels will continue to grow and everything else will only be added. Now, there's a delightful phrase, and I say that, put scare quotes around that, but former Cenovus Energy CEO Alex Pourbet is fond of saying diversification, not displacement. And
Hmm.
that's exactly what he means by that. And
Right.
that's how there is actually an intellectual framework supported by energy modeling, economic modeling, that supports this narrative. They didn't just, it's not just
Hmm.
naked
Hmm.
self-interest that they invented around the scotches over at the Petroleum Club. Um, and I should point out, before we get into the conversation about where this is all going to go, is uh, Joe Biden and his administration thought about energy very differently, very differently. And
Yes.
I
Yes.
point all the time to this seminal speech by his secretary, Treasury Secretary, Gina Raimondo. And she said, look, in the first year of the pandemic, 2020, we recognized how vulnerable the United States was to China's supply lines.
Hmm.
And we couldn't do that because China is clearly emerging as the equal to the United States or close to it, and a geopolitical opponent. And they're allied
Hmm.
with Russia, allied with Iran, allied with many of America's enemies. And so that's the block that's rising. And so Biden said, no, we're not going to be dependent on those supply lines in case
Hmm.
there's maybe a hot war. What happens if China invades Taiwan and the United States goes to
Yeah.
war with China over Taiwan? And then
Yeah.
suddenly you're still dependent on Chinese goods to run your war machine? Well, that's just clearly not going to work. So what they did
Yeah.
is they put in these huge acts, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, on and on, to build a clean energy manufacturing industry in the United States. So over the
Yeah.
past 3 years, we've had like hundreds of billions of dollars committed and invested in new battery plants, new EV plants, solar panel manufacturing plants, some wind turbine manufacturing plants. All of that industry was going to be centered in North America and its allies, and it would be like Fortress North America. We would no longer be dependent on China for those key inputs into the energy system, and we would be, transition over time into this clean energy economy that would give us energy security because we wouldn't have to import anything from China.
Right.
Okay, so the problem the problem with that is, of course, that Trump doesn't see the world like that. He agrees with Chris Wright and Danielle
Yeah.
Smith and
Hmm.
Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Canadian Conservative Party, who, was up until recently had a huge lead in the national polls. And
Yeah.
Canada, for those who are outside Canada, Canada's going to have a general election probably almost certainly this fall, if not sooner. So,
Hmm.
and this matters. So here are two very starkly different views of the world, and those are reflected in the narratives and the political strategies of the politicians and the narratives and the corporate strategies of the companies involved. And if you don't, if all you do, if all one does, as is often the case in Canada, is focus on the bickering amongst the politicians, the comments, the condemnations from the climate activists, the defensive statements, and from the oil and gas CEOs and the business community. If all we do is focus on the bickering, and that's the story that comes out every day in the National Post or the CTV or wherever it is, we've completely missed the boat. We don't, we have,
Mhm.
we need this analytical framework that I just outlined to understand to understand all of the bickering and the what people are really up to. And anyways, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we're also, we get fixated on a few fancy slogans, but we don't really understand, the big picture. Sometimes we have to look at, our economy or Alberta, but sometimes we also really need to step back and see what's going on in the US and in Europe and jurisdictions worldwide.
And that leads me to another complaint about the Alberta energy conversation in particular. And because,
Mhm.
I have these friends in Eastern Canada who say Alberta is not that important. It's only 6%. Oil and
Yeah.
gas is only 6% of the GDP. That's true, but it's also far and away the biggest source of exports. And it all goes to the US, and it's about 100, $120 billion a year. And it's
Mhm.
twice that of autos and auto parts that comes out of Ontario. And it attracts a lot of capital. So Alberta is an energy superpower already. We've talked about this in previous episodes,
Mhm.
and it's really important. I don't want to, what Alberta wants to do and what it tries to do is important. We have to pay attention to it. But I laid out sort of two views of the future energy system out to 2050, kind of what we call the oil and gas forever versus the futures electric narrative. And the
Mhm.
problem is that everyone in Alberta is lined up on the oil and gas forever.
Yeah.
Good luck finding one of them who can give you a coherent argument for it based on evidence and data. And I'll pick on
Mhm.
Brett Wilson again because he and I go back a decade, you know, scrapping on social media and on these kinds of issues. All that time, I have never seen him put together a coherent explanation for his views using evidence and data and expert opinion and whatever else. What Wilson and all others, and that includes Smith, I might add,
Yeah,
and it
absolutely.
also includes the CEOs, and it also includes
Mhm.
oil and gas engineers and other technical people and executives. What they do is they have narratives that they fervently believe in. And in the hothouse atmosphere, which is Alberta politics, they repeat those back and forth to themselves for so long and so often that they believe them.
Yeah.
So this issue of, oh yeah, no, global south demand for petrochemicals and aviation fuel is going to rise, and that'll offset any decline. And now we're good. Never once going to OPEC's modeling and saying, well, is that true? What are the numbers? So I did it and I went, holy smokes, there's not nearly as much increase in demand for petrochemicals and aviation
Yeah.
fuel as you would think. It, they don't talk about it in the narrative, the increase in road transportation, this increase in the global auto fleet. It's in the modeling.
Yeah.
It's in the modeling. And so we could have a really robust conversation in Canada about energy. And, if the oil and gas is forever advocates brought their arguments, their data, their evidence, and made a coherent argument, and we could, debate back and forth, we could have a really productive debate. They can't do it. And I don't think it's because they're lazy. They're certainly not stupid. Good God. I mean, Alberta, it's got more than its fair share of smart people running oil companies and, oil and gas engineers. What it is they're entitled and they're comfortable. They've had so many decades of prosperity. They've had their way in Alberta for so long that they
Yeah.
just don't feel the need to exercise intellectual rigor and to go in and do the analysis and come back and defend themselves. It's enough to say, hey, we're Alberta. We're look at us. Look at all the good we do for Canada. Give us the opportunity, we'll do more. Build us more pipelines and we'll, do more of it. And it's that entitlement that blinds us in Canada to what's really going on. And then, we get into this bickering with Alberta versus Ottawa and occasionally
Yeah.
with, and therein lies the root of our problem.
Yeah.
I'll toss it over to you for comment.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's partly also culture and identity. It's it's been I remember when I was a kid going to Petro Canada and buying my Olympic cups and like being proud of
Yeah,
of
good
Petro
point.
Canada. Like Petro Canada was a big deal. It was, it was something to be really proud of as Canadian. And so I don't want to see that industry, go away or, I think that that's it's hard as someone who's kind of middle-aged like me. And also, so you've got your identity, then you've got, mortgages to pay. You're sitting there at 45 years old, you've got to pay your mortgage. And that turns into fear when you think maybe your industry, especially if you're somebody who is an engineer, oil and gas engineer, and all of a sudden you're looking down at your career that's got a potential end date. So I think that fear and culture really play a big role here.
Yeah, I would agree. There's polling data from people like Dr. Jared Wesley at the University of Alberta or Janet Brown,
Hmm.
who's very well respected, that shows that oil and gas, Albertans identify with oil and gas so deeply that an attack on oil and gas is perceived as an attack on their personal identity. And over
Yeah,
50% of Albertans believe that. And so
yeah,
that is a dominant driving feature in Alberta politics. The problem is Danielle Smith has done such a good job of positioning herself as the opposition to the federal Liberal government, but also
yeah.
the proponent for this oil and gas forever narrative. I mean, it's only a province of 5 million people. It's 12.5% of the Canadian population. And yet it almost single-handedly dictates the energy conversation, the energy debate in Canada. Who else? Can you think of anybody else aside from her who has a voice in the Alberta energy conversation outside of the federal government?
Absolutely not. I mean, no.
Yeah. I mean, she more than the oil and gas CEOs for crying out loud,
Yeah.
right? So the her ability to manipulate this, and I have to say, I mean, hats off to her for being a smooth political operator because she didn't used to be like that. Remember, I don't know if you remember, but back in the day, she used to lead the Wild Rose Party in Alberta, and she almost won the election in 2012. She made a couple of faux pas. And that cost her the election in 2012, and she's learned from that. And over her years as a talk show radio host, a conservative talk show radio
Hmm.
host in Calgary, she really honed that ability to communicate. And she takes ideas that are wildly implausible, like just no basis. Her anti-vax line, for example, and her
Right.
origin, and she's promoted ivermectin and all sorts of these crazy ideas, but she says them in such a reasonable voice, and she looks so reasonable while she's doing them that people just
Hmm.
nod along and they go, "Oh, okay, sure. You want to double oil production? Okay, I think we can handle
Sounds
that.
good.
No, if you say so, okay."
Yeah.
And she's very, very good. She's very powerful, and there's no counterpoint. I wrote a column last year, and because Stephen Guilbeault, the federal environment minister, who used to be a member of Greenpeace, and so he's been portrayed as as this radical eco-terrorist, and the federal government made a big mistake. They made him the lead voice for their climate policies, which in effect are their energy policies. And in Alberta, you couldn't have made a bigger mistake because Guilbeault was just demonized. Demonized. They had um, Jonathan Wilkinson, who's from British Columbia and a much more moderate voice. And I think, he's been natural resources minister now for about 3 years,
Hmm.
and he would have been far and away the better choice to lead that conversation. He's very collaborative and there would have been lots of meetings behind the closed seat. He would have done his politics a lot better, but Trudeau chose Guilbeault and that was a mistake. And it's helped to polarize this debate. And Smith has taken advantage of it brilliantly.
Hmm.
It's been a very shrewd strategy, but that doesn't help our viewers.
No.
And all it does is polarize it. So then again, we get back to its bickering. You did this and you did that and on and on. And that's what the newspapers report, the TV news reports. And
Mhm.
so that's what Canadians think the issues are. And it's these bigger tectonic changes that are taking place at the global energy system that we
Right.
haven't seen. We haven't seen it.
Hmm.
We have such a clean electricity system already that we haven't seen the huge rollouts of renewables, for example. And this is one example. Now, you live in Portugal, so what are you seeing in Europe? Because it's vastly different there, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the EU has already seen it in the last 2.5, 3 years, huge increases in renewables. Like my district that I live in is already 100% renewable. We're seeing countries targeting, to be renewable within the next few years. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of that is related to um, wanting to stop relying on Russia and because of the invasion of Ukraine. And so it's kind of catalyzed this change. But I would say that that change has happened quite quickly and honestly with very little changes to everyday life. So these things are happening because of the government forcing the change, the European Parliament and Brussels. But like for everyday life, our everyday life really hasn't changed here, other than you see a lot more electric vehicles out on the roads, charging stations popping up everywhere, and of course, solar panels and wind becoming a lot more commonplace as well.
That's right. And, I often talk about my graduate work 40 years ago about the transition in Saskatchewan from steam tractors and horses to gas tractors and combines. That was a radical change because not only
Yeah.
did it change the way people worked, it led to, if you had a tractor, then you instead of a quarter section, you needed a half section. Well, there was a family then that was displaced off a farm. If you got a combine, now you needed a whole section. That's 640 acres. And so now that was three families displaced. And the
Right.
depopulation of rural Saskatchewan that started in the 1920s because of mechanization, that was a profound, like people back then were debating, in the pages of the newspapers about the effect that mechanization would have on the future of small communities. And now, of
Yeah.
course, what we see, those small communities are all gone. It's all regional hubs, 5 to 10,000 people city, and it's very, very different. And that hasn't happened because
Mm.
you had a gas car, now you've got an electric car. You heated with a gas furnace, now you heat with a heat pump. Uh,
Hmm.
your power grid used to be powered by coal and gas, maybe some nuclear. In the case of like France, now is powered
Yeah.
by a combination of wind and solar and nuclear and hydro. And all is that you flick on the switch and the light comes on, like it always did.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And like I think that's the thing is this whole, energy dominance that you hear Trump speak about and Danielle Smith, like people aren't envisioning that like the end user, it's very similar, like I don't really actually know where my power comes on. I just turn on the light and the lights go on. I'm not thinking of how it's generated.
Yeah, and you're like everybody. Everybody
Yeah.
just wants to flick the light on, flick the switch, and the light comes on. Energy dominance, and we'll end the show with this. This is Trump's term. And what he means is that he said it very clearly in his executive order for the energy emergency executive order. He said, "We we have more oil and gas than any place in the world." That's well, not true, by the way. Uh, I think it's fourth or fifth. The U.S. is fourth or fifth for oil, and maybe it's fourth or fifth for gas, and ninth or tenth or 11th for oil, something like that. But they are
Hmm.
the biggest producers. And
Right.
right now, by far, the U.S. is the biggest oil producer at 13.2 million barrels a day, and then comes Russia and or Saudi Arabia, depending on what they're producing at the time. And what he wants to do is produce a lot more oil and gas, push
Hmm.
those other countries out of the market, and so that gives the United States more independence, more security, more revenue, less dependence on imports. He doesn't want to import anything from Canada. You know, we're so all of that stuff, that is what he means by energy dominance. And the point
Hmm.
here is because Donald Trump half the time, I'm sure a small percentage of the time actually knows what he's talking about. But it's Danielle Smith who's picked up the energy dominance mantle. That
Right.
she's adopted that language into her narratives, into her public comments, and that's a problem. She's very specifically lined herself up with Trump. In fact, one of the things that got her into trouble is she said, "We need to give the president a win. We need to give him something." And every
Yes.
immediately she was accused of being an appeaser, kind of like Neville Chamberlain in 1939, the British prime minister who thought he had a deal with Hitler. And so this is how the debate is going, and all of that debate is, from her point of view, is perfect because it keeps the focus on her issues and her take on those issues and not on these bigger changes that are unfolding behind the scenes that are the real driver of behavior amongst her basically the oil and gas companies in Alberta and other incumbents. And
Yeah.
that's the key. That's the key. It's what's going on behind the rhetoric that we need to understand better.
Hmm.
Well, MC, we've come to the end of the Energy Show, and we're going to record this, put it up on our YouTube channel, on our playlist, and you can
Yeah.
go Energy Media uh, and search for that on YouTube and find it there. And in the coming days, our third member of our team, my wife, Joanne, is also a journalist. But she's been sick for the last couple of weeks. And by the way, we should tell everybody this is crazy. So Joanne's sick with the flu, and you fell down the steps and sprained your ankle, and you're hobbling
Yeah.
around on crutches.
Yes, that's right. So and now you're down with a bike accident. So the team is hurting at the moment.
Yeah, it's just crazy, and yet we soldier on somehow. How is your ankle, by the way?
So much better today, actually. Just the bruise, there's a little bit of bruising left, no more swelling, and I'm getting around a lot better. So thank goodness. It's hard with kids and chasing after them with a sprained ankle.
Well, good luck. Look, we'll have this up. And the reason I brought up Joe is because we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to start in the near future, including the audio portion of this show as a podcast. We'll start a podcast, and we'll have back issues of the show there as well. So, if people like to go out for a bike ride, for example, and they want to listen to it, while they're doing that, or they're, driving to work or whatever it is, if you want to listen, you can listen. But some people like to read. And so when Joe is able to, she's going to start posting these with an embedded video and a transcript. So you
Yeah.
can go on our website, and there'll be a nav bar, a link on the nav bar. It'll take you to the shows, and then you can read them and watch them as well if you want on there. So there's going to be a variety of ways for people to access our the Energy Show, and also, of course, social media. And maybe
Right.
you want to.
remind people that they can also contact us to send in their questions or comments, and we'll try to address those in coming episodes. So you can send us an email at theenergyshow@gmail.com. So the energy with an I show@gmail.com. And then you can also text us your comments or questions at 587-330-5757.
Excellent. And we're going to have where we've gone away from the live format. We've now gone to a recorded format. We're bringing in more experts. We're going to have more graphics available so we can start explaining. We talk a lot about data and evidence. Well, now we're going to start showing data and evidence when we talk about these kinds of issues and show, that we've done our homework. So
Absolutely.
thanks very much, MC. We'll see you. If we don't see you tomorrow in the next show, we'll see you later in the week.
Sounds good. Take care, everyone.